They laughed because they saw a maid. Before the night was over, they would discover the difference between wearing power and deserving respect. The Romano estate shimmered beneath thousands of golden lights, its limestone walls glowing against the warm Chicago evening like a palace built for kings instead of businessmen. Luxury sedans lined the circular driveway while valets moved with flawless precision, welcoming politicians, executives, philanthropists, and social elites who had come to celebrate another remarkable year of Dominic Romano's expanding business empire. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. A live jazz quartet filled the ballroom with soft melodies, and servers in tailored black uniforms glided silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays topped with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Every guest understood that receiving an invitation to Dominic Romano's private gala meant entering one of the most exclusive circles in the city. Reputation mattered here. Appearance mattered even more. Naomi Carter adjusted the simple white cuffs of her housekeeping uniform before stepping quietly into the ballroom with a tray of sparkling water. She kept her shoulders relaxed, her eyes lowered just enough to remain respectful without appearing timid, and moved exactly as Mrs. Ellis, the head housekeeper, had trained her during the past 4 months. Invisible people survived longest in places like this. She had learned that lesson years ago while working 2 jobs to pay hospital bills for her late father and later caring for her aging mother in a small South Side apartment barely large enough for 2 people. Tonight was simply another shift. Deliver the drinks. Keep the guests comfortable. Leave without anyone remembering she had ever been there. That plan lasted less than 5 minutes. A woman wearing an emerald designer gown accepted a glass from Naomi before glancing at her friend with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "You know," she said loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "It's almost adorable how they dress the help now. For a second I thought she was an actual guest." Laughter rippled through the circle. Another man casually examined Naomi from head to toe before chuckling into his champagne. "Give her another few years, and maybe she'll earn a chair instead of standing all night." Someone else added, "She's just a maid. I doubt she's ever even sat at a table like this." More laughter followed, louder this time, spreading through neighboring conversations until strangers who hadn't heard the original joke laughed simply because everyone else was laughing. Naomi's fingers tightened beneath the silver tray, but her expression never changed. "Would anyone else like sparkling water?" she asked gently, her voice calm enough to surprise even herself. The emerald-dressed woman smirked. "See? They train them well." Not a word of attitude. Naomi nodded politely and stepped away, pretending not to notice the whispers following her across the ballroom. Every instinct urged her to disappear into the service hallway until the evening ended, but professionalism had become her shield long before tonight. Across the room, seated alone at the head of an impossibly long dining table, Dominic Romano watched everything without speaking. His charcoal tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his posture effortless, his expression unreadable. While dozens of conversations competed for attention around him, his eyes never left the young maid quietly serving guests who believed she was too insignificant to matter. He neither interrupted the laughter nor acknowledged the insults. Instead, he lifted his crystal glass for a slow sip of sparkling water, studying not the woman being humiliated, but every face enjoying the humiliation. The music continued. The laughter slowly faded. Yet something had shifted in the room so quietly that no one except Dominic seemed to notice, and before the first course was even served, the evening had already become a test none of his honored guests realized they were taking. Naomi slipped through the ballroom with the same quiet grace she had practiced since her first day at the Romano estate, balancing silver trays while pretending that every careless remark had floated past without touching her. Years of experience had taught her that dignity was not always measured by what people said to you, but by what you refused to let them take away. As another server brushed past, he offered her an apologetic glance, yet neither of them dared to speak. Employees understood the unspoken rule. The less attention they attracted, the safer the evening remained. Near the grand staircase, the executive chef stepped into the service corridor carrying a heavy stockpot. Before he could steady his footing, one of the younger kitchen assistants stumbled while rushing around the corner, sending a basket of fresh bread crashing onto the polished floor. The young man froze, his face turning pale. He had been working at the estate for only 2 weeks and already feared he had ruined his chance at keeping the job. Without hesitation, Naomi placed her tray onto a nearby serving cart, knelt beside him, and quietly helped gather every loaf before anyone important noticed the accident. "Take a deep breath," she whispered with a reassuring smile. "Everyone makes mistakes on their first weeks. Just keep moving." The young assistant nodded gratefully, relief replacing panic as Naomi handed him the last basket. Moments later, she noticed Mrs. Ellis rubbing her wrist while reviewing the seating chart. The older woman's arthritis often flared after long hours, though she never admitted it. Naomi silently poured her a glass of water, retrieved the pain relief cream she always kept in the staff cabinet, and placed both beside her without saying a word. Mrs. Ellis looked up with tired eyes and smiled softly. "You always notice before anyone asks." Naomi simply answered, "Someone noticed me once when I needed it. I never forgot." Neither woman realized that a pair of watchful eyes had followed the exchange from across the ballroom. Dominic Romano had not moved from his chair, yet nothing escaped his attention. While influential guests competed for his approval with polished speeches and expensive gifts, the person drawing his attention was the one who expected nothing in return. At another table, the conversation turned back toward Naomi. The same woman in the emerald gown watched her assist the kitchen staff and laughed quietly. "Look at that. She acts as though kindness is going to earn her a seat at the table." Her husband smirked before adding, "Some people forget that service is all they are meant for." A few guests nodded politely, unwilling to challenge the remark even if it made them uncomfortable. Others laughed simply because laughter required less courage than silence. Naomi heard every word as she passed behind them with fresh coffee, yet her expression remained composed. She gently refilled each cup with the same professionalism she had offered before the insults began. One elderly guest accepted his coffee and quietly thanked her. Naomi smiled warmly, wishing him a pleasant evening before continuing her rounds. The old gentleman watched her leave, then glanced toward the others with visible disappointment, but he said nothing. Across the room, Dominic slowly rested his glass on the white linen tablecloth. His expression remained calm, almost detached, yet those who knew him best recognized the subtle change. His trusted chief of staff, Vincent Hale, noticed Dominic's gaze lingering not on Naomi, but on every guest who had chosen arrogance over decency. Vincent leaned slightly closer and spoke in a respectful whisper. "Would you like me to address the situation, sir?" Dominic answered without taking his eyes off the ballroom. "Not yet." His voice remained steady, almost gentle. People reveal their true character when they believe no one important is judging them. Vincent nodded once and stepped back into silence. Meanwhile, the first dinner course was announced, and elegant chairs slid across polished marble as guests prepared to take their assigned seats. Naomi moved toward the side of the dining room to assist with service, unaware that the most important moment of the evening was drawing closer with every passing second. The dining hall transformed with effortless precision as staff members pulled out handcrafted walnut chairs, adjusted embroidered linen napkins, and placed gleaming silver flatware beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Every place card had been arranged days in advance, each seat carefully chosen according to influence, partnerships, and unspoken social hierarchy. Naomi understood that invisible rules governed evenings like this just as much as written invitations did. She moved quietly along the outer edge of the room, refreshing water glasses and making certain every guest had exactly what they needed before taking their seats. She never expected anyone to remember her name, and that expectation had protected her from disappointment for years. At the center of the room, Dominic Romano remained standing behind his chair while conversations drifted between business successes, charitable foundations, luxury vacations, and private golf clubs. His guests competed politely for his attention, laughing a little louder whenever he glanced in their direction, hoping to earn even a brief acknowledgement from the man whose approval could open doors across the city. Yet Dominic contributed very little. He simply listened. Every smile, every compliment, every careless remark settled quietly into his memory. Naomi approached the head table carrying a polished silver pitcher filled with sparkling water. She refilled Dominic's glass with practiced care before moving to the neighboring seats without lifting her eyes. "Thank you, Naomi," Dominic said calmly. His voice was neither loud nor dramatic, but the simple use of her name caused several nearby guests to pause for half a second. Naomi looked up in mild surprise. "You are welcome, sir," she replied softly before continuing her work. Across the table, the woman in the emerald gown exchanged an amused look with another guest. "Well," she whispered just loudly enough for those around her to hear, "our host certainly has an excellent memory for the staff." A businessman wearing a navy dinner jacket smirked. Perhaps he remembers everyone who polishes the silver. A ripple of restrained laughter circled the table once more. Naomi continued walking as though she had heard nothing, but inside she reminded herself of the promise she had made to her mother years earlier. Never allow someone else's opinion to become your reflection. Character survives long after embarrassment disappears. Those words had carried her through eviction notices, double shifts, sleepless nights, and hospital waiting rooms. They carried her now. As the first course arrived, an elderly gentleman seated near the center accidentally dropped his linen napkin onto the marble floor. Before anyone else noticed, Naomi quietly stepped forward, retrieved it, and replaced it with a fresh pressed napkin while asking whether he would prefer another serving of warm bread. The gentleman smiled gratefully. "Young lady, your parents raised you with remarkable manners." Naomi's expression softened. "My mother always said respect costs nothing, sir." The old man nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved by the simple answer. Not everyone at the table shared his appreciation. The emerald-dressed woman leaned back in her chair with theatrical amusement. "She almost sounds educated," she remarked before turning toward another guest. "Someone should remind her not to forget which side of the table she belongs on." This time fewer people laughed. A handful lowered their eyes toward their plates, suddenly uncomfortable with how far the comments had gone. Even those who had joined the earlier jokes now hesitated, sensing an invisible tension settling over the room. Dominic noticed every shifting expression without saying a single word. Vincent Hale stood several feet behind him, silently observing the guests with the same careful attention. He had served Dominic for nearly 15 years and understood one important truth better than anyone else. When Dominic Romano became quieter than usual, it rarely meant he had stopped paying attention. It meant he was deciding exactly when the right moment would arrive. Naomi collected empty appetizer plates one by one, moving with the same quiet dignity she had carried since the evening began. She had no idea that almost every choice she made was being measured by the only opinion in the room that truly mattered, while those eager to display their wealth and status were slowly revealing something far less impressive than either. The aroma of rosemary, roasted vegetables, and freshly baked bread drifted across the ballroom as the main course was served with flawless precision. Conversation gradually grew louder again, allowing many guests to believe the uncomfortable moments from earlier had already passed. Crystal glasses clinked softly while polished silver reflected the warm chandelier light across the endless white tablecloth. Naomi continued moving between tables with quiet confidence, replacing empty glasses, adjusting misplaced napkins, and anticipating requests before they were spoken. She understood that the finest service often went unnoticed, and she had made peace with that reality long ago. Dominic Romano remained composed at the head of the table, participating only when someone addressed him directly. More often than not, he simply observed. Every guest believed they had his attention when they spoke, yet few realized he was studying how they treated people who could offer them nothing in return. That, more than wealth or influence, had always been his measure of character. As Naomi approached the center table carrying a tray of freshly poured coffee, the woman in the emerald gown casually extended her chair backward without looking. The polished wooden leg caught the edge of Naomi's path, forcing her to stop suddenly before the tray could tilt. Naomi steadied herself with remarkable control, preventing a single drop from spilling. A few nearby guests noticed and chuckled. The woman looked over her shoulder with exaggerated surprise. "Oh dear," she said with a careless smile. "I completely forgot you were standing there." The apology carried no sincerity. Instead, she leaned toward the others and laughed. Imagine if she had spilled coffee on everyone. That would have been unforgettable. Several people laughed with her, relieved that nothing serious had happened. Naomi simply answered, "I am sorry if I interrupted your evening, ma'am," and carefully stepped around the chair. Her calm response only seemed to amuse the woman further. She apologizes for my mistake. That is what makes good help so valuable. Another guest raised his glass. Professional to the very end. More quiet laughter followed, although it sounded weaker now, almost uncertain. At the opposite end of the table, the elderly gentleman who had complimented Naomi earlier frowned deeply. He looked toward the woman in green as though preparing to speak. But before he could find the words, she performed another gesture that immediately captured everyone's attention. She reached toward the empty chair positioned against the wall where staff occasionally rested between courses. With a playful smile, she slid it several feet farther away using the tip of her shoe. Better keep that out of reach, she joked. If the staff starts sitting with us, we will have to print twice as many invitations next year. This time only 2 or 3 people laughed. Most simply stared into their plates. Even those who had enjoyed the earlier jokes sensed that the evening had crossed into something deeply uncomfortable. Naomi paused for only a heartbeat. Her eyes rested briefly on the empty space where the chair had been before she quietly continued serving the next table exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. There was no anger on her face, no bitterness, only a quiet sadness that disappeared behind professional composure almost instantly. Vincent Hale watched the exchange from across the room. His hands remained folded behind his back, but his attention shifted toward Dominic. The chief of staff had witnessed hundreds of business negotiations and political dinners over the years, yet he recognized this silence better than any spoken command. Dominic slowly placed his knife and fork beside his untouched dinner plate. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet several longtime associates noticed it immediately. They stopped talking without understanding why. Dominic lifted his eyes from the table and looked directly toward the chair that had been pushed away, then toward Naomi, who was calmly serving an elderly couple as though the insults carried no weight at all. Finally, his gaze settled on every guest who had laughed, one face after another, without a single change in expression. The music continued to play softly, but beneath its elegant melody the atmosphere had become strangely still, as though the entire ballroom was holding its breath without realizing that the evening was only beginning to reveal its true purpose. Naomi carried the last tray of dinner plates toward the service entrance, grateful for the brief excuse to step beyond the reach of curious eyes and careless laughter. The quiet hallway behind the ballroom smelled of fresh bread and brewed coffee, offering a welcome contrast to the polished conversations unfolding only a few yards away. She placed the empty dishes onto the stainless steel counter and took one slow breath before reaching for the next course. Mrs. Ellis noticed the faint redness around Naomi's eyes, though not a single tear had fallen. "You can take 5 minutes if you need to," the older woman said gently. Naomi answered with the same soft smile she always wore. "Thank you, but everyone else is working just as hard. I will be fine." Mrs. Ellis rested a comforting hand on Naomi's shoulder for only a moment before returning to coordinate the kitchen staff. She had supervised hundreds of employees over 3 decades, and she knew resilience when she saw it. Naomi picked up a tray of dessert plates decorated with fresh berries and carefully arranged pastries before walking back into the ballroom. The music had shifted to a slower piano melody, and the conversations had become more relaxed as the evening progressed. She resumed her quiet rhythm, serving each guest with the same courtesy she had shown since the first minute of the gala. Many accepted their desserts without even looking at her. Others thanked her politely. A few seemed almost embarrassed by the behavior they had witnessed earlier. Yet the woman in the emerald gown remained determined to entertain herself at Naomi's expense. As Naomi approached with the final dessert plate, the woman smiled brightly enough to draw attention from neighboring tables. "Excuse me," she called. Naomi stopped immediately. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked around the table with playful confidence before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I have a question. Since you spend every evening serving dinners like this, have you ever wondered what it feels like to actually belong at one?" A heavy silence settled over the nearest tables. Nobody reached for a fork. Nobody lifted a glass. Naomi stood perfectly still, balancing the silver tray with steady hands. She could have walked away. She could have ignored the question entirely. Instead, she answered with quiet honesty. "My job is to help other people enjoy their evening, ma'am. That has always been enough for me." The woman laughed lightly and shook her head. Such a humble answer. although I suppose people become comfortable once they accept their place. A businessman sitting beside her added with an awkward grin, everyone has a role, after all. A few uncertain chuckles followed, but they faded almost as quickly as they appeared. Something about Naomi's calm dignity made the jokes sound smaller than before. The elderly gentleman lowered his dessert fork and looked directly at Naomi. "Young lady," he said warmly, "thank you for treating every person in this room with kindness, whether they earned it or not." Naomi smiled sincerely. "That is very kind of you to say, sir." Before she could continue serving, the woman in emerald reached toward the empty chair that had earlier been pushed against the wall. She tapped its polished wooden back with one finger and smirked. "Just remember," she said, "that chair is decoration tonight. Some seats are reserved for people who belong here." Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully and turned to continue walking without replying. Across the ballroom, Dominic Romano watched every second unfold in complete silence. He slowly folded his linen napkin and placed it beside his untouched dessert plate. Vincent noticed the movement immediately. Several longtime associates did as well. The conversations nearest the head table gradually stopped, not because anyone had been told to stop speaking, but because they sensed an invisible shift passing through the room. Dominic rose from his chair with calm, deliberate confidence. There was no anger on his face, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Yet as every guest instinctively turned toward him, even the piano seemed quieter, and for the first time that evening Naomi looked up just as Dominic took his first measured step away from the head of the table and began walking directly toward her. Dominic Romano crossed the ballroom without haste, yet every measured step seemed to quiet another conversation until only the soft piano remained. Crystal glasses rested untouched. Silverware stopped moving. Even the servers instinctively paused, unsure what had drawn the attention of the man whose presence alone could command an entire room without raising his voice. Naomi stood beside the dessert cart, her hands still resting lightly on the silver tray. She lowered her eyes respectfully as Dominic approached, assuming he was about to give instructions for the remainder of the evening. Instead, he stopped only a few feet away and looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn all night. "Naomi," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "have you had dinner this evening?" The unexpected question caught her completely off guard. She blinked once before answering honestly. "No, sir. The staff always eats after the guests have finished." Dominic gave a slight nod, as though confirming something he had already expected. He then turned his attention toward the long dining table where dozens of influential guests watched with growing curiosity. Without speaking another word, he walked to the empty chair that had been mocked only moments earlier. It still stood against the wall, separated from the table as though it did not deserve to belong there. Dominic rested one hand on its polished back and gently pulled it across the marble floor. The quiet sound echoed through the ballroom with surprising weight. Every pair of eyes followed the chair as he guided it to the open space immediately beside his own seat at the head of the table. The emerald-dressed woman watched in confused silence. A businessman frowned slightly, uncertain whether he understood what was happening. Vincent Hale remained perfectly still, though the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth. Dominic looked back toward Naomi. "Please," he said with complete sincerity, "come join me." Naomi stared at him, convinced she had misunderstood. She glanced toward Mrs. Ellis, then toward Vincent, searching for some indication that this was a misunderstanding or perhaps a test. Neither offered any explanation. "Sir," Naomi answered quietly, "I cannot. I am working." Dominic's expression remained warm but unwavering. "You have worked since before my first guest arrived. You have served every person in this room with patience, respect, and grace. I believe you have earned a chance to enjoy your own dinner." A wave of astonishment spread across the ballroom. Several guests exchanged bewildered glances while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman in emerald attempted a nervous laugh. "Dominic," she said carefully, "surely you are joking." He turned toward her, not with anger but with remarkable composure. "No," he replied simply. "I am correcting a mistake." Silence settled over the room once again. Dominic stepped beside the chair and rested his hand on its back, waiting patiently. "Naomi," he repeated, "the invitation is genuine." Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. Every instinct she possessed urged her to decline. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding attention, believing that humility meant remaining invisible. Yet something in Dominic's calm certainty made it impossible to dismiss the invitation as charity or spectacle. She slowly approached the table, her footsteps barely audible across the marble floor. When she reached the chair, she hesitated one final time. "Sir," she whispered, "people will not understand." Dominic answered with quiet confidence that carried throughout the ballroom. "Respect does not require permission from a crowd." He gently pulled the chair back for her. Naomi looked around the room. Some guests avoided her eyes. Others watched with disbelief. The elderly gentleman smiled warmly and gave a small, encouraging nod. Naomi finally accepted the invitation and sat carefully beside Dominic Romano. No applause followed. No one spoke. The only sound in the magnificent ballroom was the faint melody of the piano, while every person present silently realized that the seat they had insisted she could never occupy had just become the most honorable place in the room. Naomi sat with perfect stillness, her hands folded gently in her lap, as though she feared even the smallest movement might disturb the impossible moment unfolding around her. She had served dinners in elegant homes for nearly 8 years, yet never once had she imagined sitting at the same table as the people she had quietly cared for. The polished china before her remained untouched. Around the ballroom, dozens of distinguished guests watched without speaking, struggling to reconcile the image before them with the assumptions they had carried only minutes earlier. Dominic Romano resumed his seat beside her with the same calm confidence that had defined every action throughout the evening. He unfolded his linen napkin, placed it across his lap, and nodded toward one of the servers. "Please prepare another dinner plate," he said politely. "The meal should be served while it is still warm." The young server hesitated only briefly before hurrying toward the kitchen. No one questioned the instruction. No one dared. Dominic looked around the table, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "I have listened to every conversation tonight," he began in a steady voice that filled the silent ballroom without effort. "I have heard discussions about leadership, family values, generosity, and success. They were all impressive conversations." Several guests nodded cautiously, uncertain where his remarks were leading. Dominic continued, "Yet I have learned more about the character of this room from the way people treated one employee than from every speech delivered this evening." The words settled heavily across the ballroom. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody interrupted. Dominic turned toward the woman in the emerald gown with the same composed expression he had worn all night. "May I ask you a question?" She straightened immediately, forcing a polite smile. "Of course." "Earlier this evening," Dominic said, "you mentioned that certain seats belong only to certain people. I would appreciate hearing how you decide who belongs." The woman glanced around the table, searching for support that never came. "I only meant that formal dinners follow traditions," she answered carefully. There was no insult intended. Dominic nodded slightly. "Then perhaps I misunderstood." His tone remained respectful. "Did you also misunderstand when you laughed after someone called Naomi nothing more than a maid?" The woman lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. No answer came. Dominic allowed the silence to linger before looking toward the businessman who had joined the jokes. "And you?" The man cleared his throat. "It was simply conversation. Nothing personal." Dominic folded his hands together on the table. "Nothing personal," he repeated softly. "To the people speaking, perhaps. To the person listening, I imagine it felt rather personal." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The elderly gentleman quietly nodded, his expression filled with quiet approval. Dominic then looked around the ballroom, making eye contact with one guest after another. "I built my career with people who judged commitment before appearance, integrity before titles, and kindness before status. Wealth can purchase beautiful buildings, elegant clothing, and impressive invitations. It has never been able to purchase character." Every word was spoken without accusation, yet each sentence seemed to remove another layer of confidence from those who had laughed earlier. Naomi remained silent beside him, her eyes lowered as she listened. She wished the attention would disappear, but she also sensed that something far greater than herself was taking place. This was no longer about a single uncomfortable evening. It had become a quiet lesson that every person present would remember long after the last chandelier had been turned off. At that moment, a server returned carrying a freshly prepared dinner plate. placing it gently before Naomi with the same care given to every honored guest. Dominic smiled warmly toward the server before turning back to Naomi. "I hope you enjoy your meal," he said simply. For the first time all evening, Naomi allowed herself a small, genuine smile. And in that silent moment, many people around the table realized they had spent the entire night overlooking the one person who had demonstrated the greatest grace among them all. Naomi looked at the carefully prepared dinner before her, yet for several long seconds she could not bring herself to lift the fork. The elegant china, the folded linen napkin, the polished silverware, everything felt strangely unfamiliar from this side of the table. Throughout the ballroom, conversations remained suspended in respectful silence. The guests who had spent the evening discussing success now found themselves studying a woman who had never once asked to be noticed. Dominic quietly began his meal as though nothing unusual had happened, offering Naomi the simple reassurance that she belonged there because he treated her exactly as he treated everyone else. There was no ceremony in his actions, only genuine respect. Naomi finally picked up her fork and thanked the server who had prepared her plate. "It looks wonderful," she said softly. The young server smiled. "You have earned a warm dinner more than anyone here." His words carried no flattery, only honest admiration. Dominic glanced toward Naomi with quiet curiosity. "May I ask you something?" She nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Earlier this evening, after everything that was said to you, you never answered with anger." "What?" Naomi paused before speaking. Her answer came slowly, as though it had been shaped by many difficult years. "Because anger would only change who I am. Their words belong to them. My response belongs to me." Several guests lowered their eyes. Even the soft clinking of silverware seemed to disappear beneath the weight of her simple sentence. Dominic remained silent for a moment before asking another question. "Has life always made it so easy for you to think that way?" Naomi smiled gently, though a quiet sadness touched her eyes. "No, sir. It took a very long time." She rested her fork beside the plate before continuing. "When my father became ill, my mother worked every extra shift she could find. After he passed away, I left college because someone needed to help pay the bills. Since then I have cleaned homes, served tables, cared for elderly neighbors, and taken any honest work I could find. My mother always reminded me that difficult seasons can take away comfort, but they should never take away kindness." The ballroom remained perfectly still. Nobody interrupted. Naomi continued without bitterness. "Some families I worked for remembered my name. Others never did. Some thanked me every day. Others barely looked at me. I learned that I could not control how people saw me. I could only decide what kind of person I would be every morning when I woke up." The elderly gentleman slowly removed his glasses and quietly wiped the corner of one eye before smiling toward Naomi. Across the table, the businessman who had laughed earlier stared silently at his untouched dessert. The woman in the emerald gown no longer carried the confidence that had filled her voice only minutes before. She watched Naomi with an expression that had shifted from amusement to quiet reflection. Dominic folded his hands together and looked around the table once more. "There is something else all of you should know," he said calmly. "Several weeks ago, one of our kitchen employees collapsed from exhaustion before the morning shift. Before anyone called management, Naomi stayed beside him, contacted emergency services, informed his family, and remained at the hospital until his sister arrived. When I offered to recognize her publicly, she declined because she said she had only done what any decent person should do." Naomi looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was not a special thing," she said quietly. Dominic answered with a gentle smile. "Perhaps that is exactly what makes it special." A silence unlike any earlier settled across the ballroom, not one born from embarrassment, but from reflection. For the first time that evening, the guests were no longer looking at Naomi's uniform. They were finally seeing the person who had been wearing it all along. The final course slowly came to an end, yet no one seemed eager to leave the table. The laughter that had echoed through the ballroom earlier in the evening had vanished completely, replaced by thoughtful silence and quiet conversations spoken in lower voices. Naomi finished only a small portion of her dinner, still overwhelmed by the unexpected place she now occupied. She looked around the magnificent room one more time, not with pride, but with gratitude. Nothing about who she was had changed during the last hour. She wore the same simple uniform. She carried the same gentle spirit. The only thing that had changed was the way others had finally chosen to see her. Dominic Romano slowly stood once again, lifting his crystal glass with calm confidence. Every guest instinctively followed, rising to their feet until the ballroom became perfectly still. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments, sensing that something important was about to be said. Dominic looked first toward Naomi before turning his attention to everyone gathered around the table. This evening was organized to celebrate another successful year, he began. Many people have congratulated me for building a prosperous company and surrounding myself with talented partners. I appreciate those kind words. But success has never depended only on numbers. It depends on the people whose names rarely appear in headlines. His eyes briefly met those of every employee standing quietly along the walls of the ballroom. The people who prepare every meal before sunrise. The people who polish every floor before the first guest arrives. The people who welcome strangers with kindness even when kindness is not returned. They are not background characters in someone else's story. They are part of the foundation that allows every success in this room to exist. The words settled over the gathering with quiet strength. Dominic then turned toward Naomi. Tonight, many of you saw a uniform before you saw a human being. Naomi never asked for recognition. She never demanded respect. She simply offered it freely, even to those who withheld it from her. The elderly gentleman slowly raised his own glass. To Naomi, he said warmly. One by one, other guests followed. The businessman who had laughed earlier lifted his glass with visible humility. To Naomi. Several women repeated the toast. Others quietly echoed the words until nearly every voice in the ballroom joined together. Even the woman in the emerald gown slowly rose from her chair. She walked around the table with measured steps until she stopped beside Naomi. Her confident smile had disappeared, replaced by genuine regret. "Miss Carter," she said quietly enough that the room leaned in to hear. "I judged you without knowing you. I allowed my pride to become louder than my manners. I am sincerely sorry." Naomi looked at her for a long moment before offering the same gentle smile she had given every guest throughout the evening. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I hope we both leave tonight remembering that kindness is easier to carry than embarrassment." The woman nodded, visibly moved by the grace she received instead of resentment. Dominic raised his glass one final time. "May we never measure another person's worth by where they stand in a room, but by how they choose to treat others when nobody expects them to." Crystal glasses met with a quiet, respectful chime that echoed beneath the chandeliers. As the evening came to a close, guests no longer passed Naomi without acknowledgement. Many thanked her personally before leaving. Some shook her hand. Others simply offered warm smiles that had been absent only hours before. When the ballroom finally emptied and the lights dimmed, Naomi carefully folded her napkin and quietly returned to help the remaining staff clear the tables despite every invitation to leave the work for someone else. Dominic watched her for a final moment before smiling to himself. Titles had remained exactly where they belonged, fortunes had not changed, and no grand speeches had erased the past. Yet in one unforgettable evening, an entire room had been reminded that true dignity cannot be given by wealth, nor taken away by mockery. It simply waits for someone with enough courage to recognize it.